Good morning. Welcome to this module on script writing. In this session, we shall have a look at film plot and plot structures. Imagine you have watched a film and a friend asks you what the film was about. What would you say? You would give reference to the main character, the protagonist, and you would say what is the conflict that they had to face, what is the fight, the battle against, and whether they won or lost it, and how did they do so. Is this the story? This is actually the story plot, the storyline or the plot line. There is a vast difference between these two. Often they are interchangeably used, these two terms. Let's have a look at what they are. When we are talking about a story plot, the plot is like a blueprint. It's like a map that you give for a journey. The story is actually the journey, the adventure that the protagonist has to take. The plot lists out how the journey is to be taken. So if you see, the plot is the series of the events that happens one after the another in a sequential manner, whereas the story along with that in the process of going through that journey has a wholesome of character development, personal relationships, emotions, themes of the story. If the story involves the character and how it develops through the progress of the plan, the plot lays out the plan as event after event. Now look at what the story is. The story is the more comprehensive narration. It's the wholesome, it's the complete narration which tells us what happens to the character, how it develops, how it grows into a stage where it can fight the conflict, it can face the conflict, and towards the end how it is going to be coming out as a successful or a not successful character towards the end. So it shifts from this unbalanced equilibrium that's there at the beginning to a more composed equilibrium towards the end for the main character, the protagonist. It talks about different characters, the characters which support the main character, the antagonist, the different conflicts that they have to be facing, and all of this in a more chronological fashion. So there will be an equilibrium that you set at the beginning where you introduce your character in its own place, the world in which it exists, and what happens to that character post that. What are the different people that it meets, the different consequences that they have to meet because of its actions, what happens at the conflict stage, and how it overcomes the conflict. All of this in detail while you explain what the character is, how it makes its decisions, a little bit about the past, because the past are the ones that create the layers of the characters, and with all of this, how it makes decisions to face the conflict, and also what happens after that. So the story is like you describing a very brief summary of what happens to the protagonist while focusing on this course of its journey. While writing a good story, we'll have to concentrate on many aspects like the character development, the conflicts and the resolutions that we'll have to take, the themes and messages which have to be woven with the story, and how are you going to be structuring and pacing this. A story, when we're talking about the character, we deal with how the character has been groomed or described by you as a writer. We have to focus on the depth, the layers, the emotional depth of the character, because that is what forces the character to make decisions when it meets with its audience, with the conflicts. So while writing the character, breathe life into it, make it more real, make it more relatable, make it more round, so that your character will be more relatable to the audience who are watching. So while watching a story, the audience are simply not just watching it, they are feeling your character, the story line that you're providing. So if they can relate to the protagonist that you show, they can relate to the outcome of the film as well. So if they see the character, if they can feel the character, they'll be able to relate to the decisions that the character makes. They'll be able to relate to the kind of struggle that the character goes through, and hence they will feel sympathetic or they will feel for the character that you show. So the character has to be more relatable. So in between your story, we will have to be weaving universal topics, some topic that the audience can relate to, something that they come across in daily life. You will have to throw instances which they might also come across in daily life. Okay, so that's what will make your audience interested in the story that you show. And resolution, the climax and the resolution. If in such a situation, based on the characterization and the kind of guidance that the character gets, the main protagonist gets, what would be the conflict, how strong does the protagonist face the conflict, and what is the resolution that they will create. All of this has to be given at the right moment in the story, and only then it will create an interest. The themes and messages. In any story, there would be an underlying message which the the writer as such would want to give the audience. The underlying message can simply be something like truth triumphs over evil, good wins over evil, or it could be something that talks about patriotism or passion, or it could be about love or relationship. Anything could be the theme. Now that can't be separately written as a line or a scene. It has to be seen, or it has to be woven along with the storyline. Every time a character speaks with another character, every time there's a conflict or a decision that has to be overcome, taken, in all of those, in little by little, in phases, you will have to be you have to be weaving this, the thread of your theme or the message that you want to give to your audience. And the structure and pacing. How are we going to be giving away the instruction, or giving away the information at the right time, giving away those twists and those plot points at the main point when the audience is expecting. You as a writer should understand what will create more suspense, what will create more interest for the audience, and place it at the right moment and give it to them when it is needed. The plot. Now if that's the story, what is the plot then? The plot is the sequence of events. So you know your complete story, but you need to have a map that arranges the structure of events. Only when it is arranged properly will it create that interest. So you need to strike a balance between the story and the plot. If the plot is going to be the arrangement of the events, then the story is going to be a rounded theme. It's going to be having character development, it's going to be having the themes, it's going to be having the settings. While developing the plot, you're more concerned about the sequence of events. It's just not what happens, it is why and how it happens. That's more important in the plot. If that's laid out, the blueprint is ready for us to go ahead with describing the story in further. So it's the plot that typically adheres to the structured timeline. So if you have that timeline, you know how exactly the story is going to be moving forward, more purposeful and more focused. That is what is required. So the difference between the story and the plot, in the plot you understand what happens, then what, and so what. So it's going to be in the chronological fashion, and you have a reason, the cause and effect, the domino effect of how your story is going to be moving forward. What does the protagonist do? What happens after that? What is the consequence? What is the repercussion? So with this, we develop the story. So there is going to be a person who has a life, who has a very balanced life, very normal living. The audience is able to engage themselves, or rather connect themselves to that character. Then comes a smaller conflict. The protagonist has to decide whether they will go for it or not, and then there is a particular point where they are forced to do it. They might find a friend, a guide, or someone who pushes them. They might have a power which makes them move forward, and towards the end meeting that conflict, meeting that climax of whether winning it, what happens, do they overcome that conflict that's there, or do they lose to it, and then what follows. So it's all going to be arranged in this sequential order. So the plot can be in the chronological fashion. It has to happen event after event, whereas when it comes to the story, it need not always be in the chronological fashion. It can be non-sequential also. You can choose to begin the story by showing the climax or by showing the conflict. You can still start the story showing the end sequence and then move back to a flashback of what happens to the protagonist. That also could be done. But for that, a simple example that we can give for a story or understanding the story and the plot would be, all of us would have heard of the Cinderella story. You would have seen the movie Cinderella. So if you're going to be charting the plot and the story for this, what would we say? For a plot, we would simply say there is a girl who's lost her father and then moves on to live with her stepsisters and the stepmother. She has abused, she is made to do all the household chores, she has a very hard living, and then from that character she moves on to become this most desired princess after whom the prince comes. So that will be a plot. When we describe the story of this, we are going to be talking about the character development. We are going to be saying how Cinderella, a beautiful young girl, loses her father and then she becomes all alone in that house, though she has her stepsisters and her stepmother, how ill-treated, what are the different ordeals that she has to meet, the adversaries that she has to come across, the connections that she makes with people and animals, the fairy godmother, different characters coming in who help her. She goes to the dance at the kingdom, at the king's palace, how she meets the prince, what happens over there, how she loses this, the glass shoe of hers, how the prince comes in search of her. In spite of not fitting anyone, the prince still endures to, make the shoe, go in search of this princess and find this girl, Cinderella, and finally the shoe fits her. and then she becomes the princess of the land, the queen of the land. That's how the story ends. So the difference between the plot and the story is, in the plot you have to be very sequential, in a chronological fashion you have to say what comes after, the cause and the effect. When it comes to the story, it's more rounded. You go on to explain what happens with a lot of depth, emotion, character development and progress, while you also give the setting and the theme, where it happens and how it happens. So in this story you would say the theme would be of love, of family, of forgiveness, of truth over evil. It could be many things as such. Okay, let's move on to the anatomy of the plot structure. These are the three basic blueprints that many writers use to create an intriguing and solid narrative. The three-act structure given by Aristotle talks about three parts. He divides the story into three parts: Act 1, Act 2 and Act 3. The Act 1 talks about setup and introduction, the Act 2 the confrontation and development, and Act 3 resolution and conclusion. Based on this, Gustav Freytag, he developed a structure which adds two more components along with these. It is the rising action and the falling action. So there is an exposition, then comes the rising action, goes to the climax, then there's a steep falling action, and then the resolution. Okay. After reading many literary books and Shakespearean tragedies, Gustav comes up with this kind of a plan for a plot which we see that many writers follow. Now the hero's journey, that's also one of the common blueprints that we use, talks about a very detailed character arc. It is also based on the basic three-act structure. The three-act structure, you have Act 1, Act 2 and Act 3. Like we already said, in the exposition, you see that the character is introduced to the audience. You see the character and the world that they belong to much before the action begins. So the character goes on to meeting the conflict before it enters into the Act 2. You have the characters, you have the setup, you know which location they belong to, you introduce the character with their fears, with their, their nature, how strong they are, how weak they are. You tell your audience what kind of person this is, your main protagonist. And then after meeting the conflict, the preparation level, how good is the character to meet the conflict, till then is in Act 1. At plot point 1 exactly is where the conflict is met. So in Act 2, in the middle, we see the confrontation. So after meeting the conflict, your character goes on to find out how difficult the obstacle is, one after another. So when the confrontation happens, it starts understanding its own self. The protagonist is going on to understand his own nature of whether he is strong enough to face this, whether he should move forward or whether he should, hide behind his fears. All of that happens over here. And then after meeting the confrontation, he understands that it is important, this ordeal is important for him to go further. He has a reason to go par that. And then in the Act 3, we find the resolution. After meeting the conflict, goes on to understand that this is what is required for his people, for his belonging, for his own, self. And then what happens post that? He turns into a more confident, a more better person, and that's how this ends. So plot point 1 and plot point 2 are two important points, or other twist points of the story, where you need to give whether he is ready and what happens in meeting the ordeal, and in plot point 2, how he meets it and what he decides to do with his life post that. This is the detailed version of the same, where you see at the beginning, everything is set up very calmly, and then the first incident happens. Your character gets to meet the first incident where he has his own fears of facing it, so he does not face it. Then comes second thoughts. At the climax of Act 1, towards the end, there is a decision that's made that he will decide that he will go face the obstacle. And then one after another, to test his confidence, to test his strength, the obstacles move on, and it's in the ascending action. The midpoint, where you show the big twist, is often the place where the protagonist has to change his approach of meeting the conflict. Post that, what happens? The crisis is met, and all other subplots also develop during this time. The subplots are other characters and other events that are going to be supporting the protagonist to meet that final climax. And post that climax, Act 2 gets over. When Act 3 begins, the consequence of how the conflict has been met happens. So post meeting the conflict, the resolution part is the descending action. What happens post that, how again the equilibrium is set, but now a much more confident protagonist is the outcome. Okay, Freytag's pyramid. This is the original structure of what Gustav Freytag gave for writing a plot structure. The most important point being C, which is the climax, and we have a before and after for it, the rising and the falling action. A more elaborate way of explaining Freytag in the beginning there is an exposition. The exposition is the introduction of the character. You see a straight line. So we show the audience that this protagonist or this character is someone like us. A normal life, we exhibit the character along with the setting, along with the background, where he stays, what he does, his living, all of that is shown at a point. Just before the rising action happens, you introduce the first incident, the first conflict stage, where the character is supposed to be meeting the conflict. That is going to be disrupting the normal life of this protagonist, and then what happens? There is a rising action. One after another, the tension is going to be rising. You introduce the different stakes that the character has to face in the conflict. And then at the climax level, that's the turning point where the protagonist has to decide. Now that is the place where the destiny of the protagonist is going to be changing. So are we going to be meeting that conflict or not? Is there a way back, or should we be meeting the conflict? That's the decision making phase. So the rising action gives smaller obstacles one after another, pushing our character to meet that climax. So once that climax is met, once the tension over there is solved, then comes the falling action. It's a swoop down. It's like a roller coaster ride. So it takes you up little by little, increases the tension level of yours, meets the climax, and then after that, the protagonist has a falling action. One after another, it is solved. It gets resolved. So in the falling action, we see the protagonist solving all of those main crises, and then what happens to the story further. Then there's a denouement, where you take a breath before stepping out of the story. You show the audience what happens to the character, the changed protagonist, how the normal life has come back to an ease. So the tension releases, and then what happens to the protagonist and his homeland, his belongings, whatever that he set the journey for. Okay, we have the hero's journey. This is the again a most popular kind of plot structure that could be used. Like I already said, this is a very detailed character arc. So in this structure, if you see, you can find the character moving through different stages before it comes to become that confident and a leader kind of a journey. We see the hero is already in a very normal, ordinary world where your audience can relate to. Then there is a call for adventure. It could be anything. It could be to save him, to save his loved ones. It could be to taking an ordeal. It could be to save the nation. Any kind of adventure for which he is identified or he falls for. Then he refuses. He does not want to take it for very many reasons. It could be his inner fears. It could be something telling him that he's not capable to meet it, or he could just think that it is not wanted. Then he meets up a mentor. Now the mentor could be a guide, could be a friend, could be anybody in the family, or could be an authority that tells them that they should be taking this ordeal, and they also offer a particular kind of advice or particular kind of it could be anything that would help the person, it will help the hero to take up this journey. Now with that, you need to cross the threshold. That's the point at point 5 where the protagonist decides that they will cross the threshold and they will take up this journey. They will face the conflict. From there, in the journey towards meeting that ordeal, they meet their tests. They go through many tests. They go through many obstacles, and they understand who their allies are and their enemies are, who helps them, at what time do they need help, what are their shortcomings, all that is there. And then they find a different kind of an approach with which they have to meet. At this stage, they meet the greatest ordeal in their life, their decision. They're meeting the conflict which decides whether they're going to be living after this. It becomes almost like a death point, and how they develop themselves into a new person. The rebirth happens over there. Then the 9th one, the reward with what they receive from that conflict after facing it. It could be the confidence level, it could be gaining something, it could be gaining a love life, it could be getting back their homeland, it could be anything. With that, how they come back to their place, come back to that first place where they started off. So on the road back, they realize that they are a much more better person now, much more confident person now. And then the resurrection happens. Now, with this power, their ordeal for life is much more. Their responsibilities increases, and they return with the elixir. With this superpower, they come back to that first place where they started off, but now as a much better person. Now, for examples, we could see many different films where all of these is followed. You have the 3-act structure well laid out. You have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and in that you could see how the character develops through these phases. Now, if you see The Lion King, the hero's journey is set in the African savannah with the theme of responsibility and self-discovery. Like mentioned, now this is going to be a plot line. It has a well-rounded story over it, and in between you have the theme also being mentioned. At every place there is responsibility and there is self-discovery, finding out, the protagonist finding out what he is capable of and what is his role for himself and for his people. Okay. While writing plot structures, there are many different ways if you write it for films or for short films or for the television medium or for the OTT. Now, when you take movies or short films, there is going to be the complete plot structure that has to be written and a well-rounded story, because you have the time to deliver your concept. When it comes to television show, it is more episodic in nature, which means every single episode has to have this story arc, a proper beginning, a good middle, a nice climax, and then the resolution part, a proper end. So every single episode with its characters, with its main plots and subplots have to deliver that. Okay. To sum it up, today we have seen what is the plot, what is the story, and the difference between both and how both of this has to be balanced to give a very gripping story to our audience. We have to remember that the audience are not only watching the film, they are with the film, they are feeling for the film. They have the character in front of them with whom they can relate. So they have to feel for the character, the audience that they go, and the outcome of it. So for that, you need to strike a balance well, between this plot and the story. And with this, we have to weave our themes that we want to give. So that will make a good story, an interesting one that your audience can relate with. Thank you.